Welcome back, everyone. I am Cas Piancey, and I am joined, as usual, by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
Oh, I'm a little nervous. How are you, Cass?
um, I'm not nervous. I'm ready for this. We're gonna be talking about a person who we've both written about and discussed before. Maybe not on the podcast very much, but we've definitely written about them and had issues after writing about them. So I understand why Bennett is a little nervous, but everything we're going to be discussing today is public record. Like there's nothing, and we're also not going to make any scandalous claims. Everything that we're discussing right now, you can find for yourself in the Epstein files, unless the DOJ took these files down, which they may have. We're talking about Brock Pierce and his relationship to Jeffrey Epstein. I want Bennett to describe Brock's early career. Let's start at childhood actor. But I also just want to lead with, if you want to follow along with us right now, you can go to protos.com, type in Brock Pierce. It'll be the first article that comes up in your search, and go ahead and click that. And you can kind of follow along with what we're going to be discussing today. But yeah, go ahead, Bennett, and introduce folks to who Brock Pierce is in case they're unfamiliar.
Brock Pierce is a former child actor who starred in like The Mighty Ducks and the Mighty Ducks sequel. As a teenager, he retired from acting and immediately became part of this entity called Digital Entertainment Network, which he was doing in collaboration with Mark Collins Rector, who'll come up in a minute, unfortunately. Den was supposed to be providing videos over the internet, like short television style shows, but over the internet. It kind of didn't work because it was too early. The infrastructure wasn't really there. There wasn't enough demand for video delivered over the internet.
And I want to add, there's clips of these shows available on the internet that they put out, and they're terrible. I mean, these are really bad. They're worse than generic sitcoms and stuff. And a lot of them revolve around like gay and lesbian teenagers. But sorry, I just wanted to let people know, if you want to find clips of these shows that Den put out, you can find them.
Yes. And Den was going to be a multi-million-dollar IPO towards the end of the 1990s. But then that IPO ended up needing to get shit-canned because Mark Collins Rector was accused of sexual assault and other forms of predation. Following this, Pierce left Den and decided to instead start Internet Gaming Entertainment, which was gold mining for WoW, basically. They hired a bunch of people in other countries and stuff to grind for gold in WoW, and then they tried to sell that gold to other people. I think there was also some stuff for a while where they were selling like fully leveled characters and things like that.
Yes. And in case anyone is unfamiliar, like some of our listeners, I think, are older than me, which is not exactly young. World of Warcraft is what Bennett is talking about right now. He also did it for EverQuest. So like a bunch of different they're called MMORPGs. A bunch of people get together and play a kind of fantastical game online where they try to complete missions. That is supposed to be the fun part, but what Brock Pierce did was take that and be like, okay, well, we're going to loot farm. We're going to level up these characters, get expensive loot, good loot, and then we're going to sell that loot or those characters to other players. And it became a very profitable business. So profitable that Goldman Sachs got involved. And you can take it away again, Bennett.
Specifically, Steve Bannon got involved. This is somewhat after he left Goldman Sachs, but he was able to bring in some other Goldman Sachs guys for their money, and they come in, take over IGE for like $60 million or something like that. And so that's where Pierce and Bannon began working together publicly. And it was kind of like a big infusion of cash, which Pierce would end up committing to some of his later ventures. Pierce does a couple of other things kind of around the gaming space. He ends up involved with like a venture capital fund called Clearstone Ventures, where another Tether co-founder also is a general partner. That's William Quigley. And after a couple of years bouncing around that space, he ends up getting involved with Bart and Bradford Stevens as they were initially setting up their cryptocurrency venture fund, which would eventually become Blockchain Capital.
Yeah, this was just a fund, to be clear. Like this was part of the Stevens brothers. They had their own investment firm, and they just started this separate little cryptocurrency fund that went on to become what we now call Blockchain Capital.
Yes. And so Pierce was majorly involved in the early years of Blockchain Capital until he was forced out when people again paid attention to Brock Pierce's history. During his time at Blockchain Capital, he also got involved in a bunch of other cryptocurrency projects. He was part of Mastercoin, which became Omni, which is where Tether originally launched. He
co-founded Tether, to be clear. Yes. This is a co-founder of Tether.
He co-founded Realcoin, which became Tether when it was bought out by the Bitfinex principals. He was part of Sunlot Holdings and Gox Rising, two different initiatives that hope to either revive or purchase Mt. Gox at different points. He got involved with Noble Markets around this point, which was like trying to be this NASDAQ-listed cryptocurrency exchange and ended up becoming a Puerto Rican international financial entity that marketed itself as a bank. We'll probably get back to that.
Yeah. Let's pause here, actually, because I want everyone to... So you have a kind of a framing of who Brock Pierce is. He's been quite successful with a lot of these things. No one knows his exact net worth, as is usually the case with extremely wealthy elite individuals, but he likely is a billionaire, I will say. He at least has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
He claimed to be a billionaire back in like 2018, and when he was like pressed on it, he said, "Oh, if I'm not a billionaire yet, I'll just make a token and then I'll be a billionaire," or something to that general effect.
Yeah. I don't need money. I can make tokens. That's kind of a basic understanding of who Brock Pierce is, but I want us to talk about...
Well, I glossed over. I was talking about his professional career there. During some of those things, there were some other personal struggles which were going on. So Mark Collins Rector, who we mentioned as part of Den, who's a close friend, or at least was at the time a close friend of Brock Pierce, was eventually indicted for some of his sexual crimes and fled the United States to go to Spain. Brock Pierce went to Spain with him. Pierce has claimed he was unaware of the indictment and was unaware his good friend was a fugitive from the law when they did this. But nonetheless, Pierce was living with this fugitive from the United States justice system together in Spain. Eventually, Spanish authorities raided the house to arrest Mark Collins Rector. They found gigabytes and gigabytes of child pornography and a bunch of other stuff like that. This broke in some of I think the Hollywood Reporter broke it in the United States and tied Brock Pierce to it, causing him some problems in terms of his reputation and stuff that have continued to dodge him, with people claiming he's friendly with pedophiles. We'll get to that. And so, yes, he has for years been plagued with various controversies surrounding how many of his close friends appear to be pedophiles or other forms of sexual criminals.
Yeah, and he's denied all of this, and more or less I wouldn't say he's claimed to be a victim, but he's kind of pushed forward the idea that he was a young kid when all of this stuff started. If anything, you can't blame a 17, 18, 19-year-old kid for making bad decisions. It's a fine line to walk. I'm not going to really get into it right now. I think there's good reason to say that the behavior that was happening then has kind of continued throughout the rest of his career. A lot of people talk about the way that he behaves behind closed doors and stuff. And the rumor mill is not necessarily good to him. And that is why, for instance, he had to leave Blockchain Capital, like you mentioned.
And why he ended up having to leave the Bitcoin Foundation.
That's right.
And some other things like that is because these controversies which were known about, which had been reported, were once again brought to prominence, including when John Oliver at one point made a joke referencing a popular documentary called An Open Secret, which referenced some of the earlier period of Brock Pierce's life when his friends were implicated in these sexual crimes.
Yeah, and there's issues with that film. I won't say the film is perfect, but it also raises some pretty disturbing questions. So, buyer beware when it comes to watching that and taking in what they say in it at 100% truth, but it is very interesting, I guess I'll say.
And I'll also add that like the nature of the cycle of abuse is that victims often become perpetrators or people who perpetuate the thing. And so there is a decent chance that many of the people, including or many of the people around Epstein who may have been perpetuating or perpetrating sexual crimes were at some point perhaps themselves a victim of some of that behavior.
I spoke to a victim yesterday, not of Epstein, but a victim of abuse. And I said to them, one of the things I said to them was, it's very fascinating to me how so many of the victims were tasked with finding more victims and that they would go on to do it. And we both came to this conclusion that I'm no psychologist and I'm not trying to say I am or make any kind of claim that I am, but you have, all of control rested from you, and you lose all control. It feels like when something like that takes place, and it feels like a way to get that power and that control back is to be like, okay, fine. I'm going to go get more people now. I'm the one who has the power. So it's not to say it's forgivable or acceptable behavior, but at least there's a way to understand it,
Yes. And so that we've talked now about some of the broader context around this Tether co-founder. Cas, could you start with Brock Pierce and Jeffrey Epstein becoming people who communicate on a semi-regular basis? How did that happen? What did it look like?
Yeah. So in 2010, this is 2 years after Jeffrey Epstein had already been arrested for and then eventually accepted a guilty plea for procuring minors for prostitution. That happened in 2008. And by 2010, he's still struggling with the ramifications of that. He's still getting civil lawsuits. He's still facing a lot of media attention about what he's accused of. There's new victims coming forward, new lawsuits, new problems. So he desperately wants to try to fix this, and he doesn't know how. So he reaches out to someone named Alfred Seckel. Most people probably are not super familiar with this guy. He was well known in, I guess, like in the Epstein circles. He dated for many years. He dated Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. Ghislaine Maxwell, if you're unfamiliar, is basically known as the madam for Jeffrey Epstein. So Al Seckel was dating Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Isabel. And he was in regular contact with Jeffrey Epstein, and Epstein reached out to him and said, hey, I need you to scrub the internet of my sexual assault issues and my legal issues. I need you to get rid of this stuff. Al Seckel says he'll do it for $25,000. So Jeffrey Epstein pays him $25,000. Then Al Seckel asks for $10,000 more because it turns out he didn't give the money to who he was supposed to. Then he asks for $10,000 more. Then he says he wants to put on a conference, and the conference is going to cost somewhere like $100,000, possibly, maybe more. It's going to be a very expensive conference. It's going to be hosted on Jeffrey Epstein's private island. And Al Seckel says, this is great for you. Like, we're going to wipe everything clean, and we're going to make you out to be a philanthropist, a science philanthropist, somebody who cares about giving. And this conference is going to be the start of a new beginning for your reputation. So despite having problems now and concerns about the honesty of Al Seckel and the ability for him to follow through with his promises, Epstein goes ahead with this conference, and the conference is called the Mindshift Conference. One of the invitees is Brock Pierce. Originally, Brock had been planned to, because he has a winery, I guess, Brock Pierce had been planned to do a wine tasting, but Epstein said, no, I don't want a wine tasting. Forget it. So instead of doing a wine tasting, Brock Pierce does a presentation on cryptocurrencies. And despite the fact, it turns out Epstein hates this conference. He sends an email pretending to be someone else, pretending to be this random woman named Susan. And he tells Al Seckel it's the mind shit conference. He says it was the worst thing that the Epstein Foundation has ever funded. And he's complaining as this fictitious woman, even though the email has all the spelling errors that Epstein includes. It has all the grammatical errors that Epstein. It's obviously Jeffrey Epstein. Al Seckel actually responds and says, "I'm not an idiot. I know that this is you, Jeff." To which Jeffrey Epstein does not respond. But one of the important little tidbits in this angry, rambling email that he sends to Al Seckel is Reichardt was interesting, as was Brock. So he mentions two names as people he enjoyed and thought they had a interesting presentation during this conference that he hated. And very quickly after that, which takes place in January of 2011, Brock Pierce and Jeffrey Epstein start to become pretty close.
And so this conference is like the main connection we knew of between Jeffrey Epstein and Brock Pierce before this recent release of the files. That was the thing people would always point to be like, no, Brock Pierce didn't just have these problems when he was younger. He's still actively choosing to associate with pedophiles. And so from that email, like you said, they became good friends and they start to financially collaborate, it seems like. So, Pierce sort of asks Epstein for his advice on a bunch of the legal and financial situations he repeatedly finds himself in.
Yeah, they're not necessarily doing business together yet, but Brock Pierce is asking for advice. It seems like Jeffrey Epstein's also occasionally reaching out to ask questions about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and stuff like that. So a relationship begins where they're at least asking each other questions about finance and cryptocurrencies. And that's when things begin to get really weird and gross. I want to say none of what we're suggesting here is proof of any crime. And I suspect, though Brock Pierce has not responded, at least as of recording, Brock Pierce has not responded to Protos. He has not put out any messages. There's no PR about this. He's just stayed silent. So no one has heard anything from him. It's worth saying none of what we're sharing here is necessarily criminal. It just looks weird and gross and disgusting. Okay, so that's the preface. Sorry, Bennett. What do they start talking about after they've done a little bit of discussion of business, finance, and cryptocurrency?
As we said, Brock reaches out to see what Jeffrey Epstein thinks about a fund the Clearstone Group is putting together. That's the gaming venture capital fund that we mentioned that Brock was involved with. Then they will eventually engage in some business transactions together, but before those business transactions, there's a series of strange and uncomfortable emails where they seem to be discussing women in some unusual and uncomfortable manners. Like there is one email where Jeffrey Epstein is talking about these people who are in LA, encouraging Brock to go meet up with these people. He tells Brock, don't bring your girlfriend to this.
And Brock responds, will do, broke up with my girlfriend last night, so that won't be a problem. And then later, after this meeting, Brock says, I had a great time with the girls. Hope they had fun too. Thanks. Best regards. Now, like a little weird considering who's involved. Yeah. Criminal? No, definitely not. Right. It's innocuous enough. There's just some back and forths about some women. Every man has talked about women every straight man has at least had a conversation with their friend about like, hey, I think this girl would be great for you or something. And it's like, okay, yeah, I'll meet up with her. This could literally be something like that, right? Except there's two girls named. The whole thing is weird. I'm going to be honest. It's very strange. Actually, most people don't do this.
Well, especially most people don't do this like once they're adults. Like
That's
when
right.
you're a 7th grader and you're insecure, you'll be talking to your buddies and be like, "Ooh, what do you think about so and so or whatever?" But like the older you get, the more you like understand that these people are humans and you should engage with them like as a human being and not as like a object for your play. So yeah, there's those emails you talked about. There's another email where Jeffrey Epstein talks about his new Russian in LA that he wants Brock to meet up with. And man, that's a sentence that has a lot of possible implications, very few of which we can definitively say
Yeah,
it means.
very strange. My new Russian is in LA. Okay, I don't know what that means.
How many Russians do you have, Epstein?
Yeah.
Anyways,
We know at least
there's
one.
At least one.
Yeah.
There's another one after that where Brock Pierce is telling Epstein that he knows a girl in New York.
So this is, and I just want to clarify because this is, Epstein says, hey, I have a Russian in LA. Can you meet up with her? And Brock says, oh, yeah, I think so. And then he doesn't. He isn't able to meet up with this Russian girl. And he says like, oh, sorry, I couldn't meet up with this Russian girl. But also, I have a girl for you in New York.
Brock gives Jeffrey Epstein the name of this woman and encourages Jeffrey Epstein to check her Facebook, to which Jeffrey Epstein responds, cute, which is uncomfortable and unpleasant in light of the broad context we all know about these individuals.
And again, nothing criminal here, just very strange stuff.
Not
now,
necessarily
though,
criminal at the
yeah,
very
that's right.
least.
Now is when it starts to get really, really weird, in my opinion. And this is when I start to wonder, I think at worst, what we've seen so far is, who knows what the worst possible thing is that we've seen so far. But I will say that the emails don't present anything that you could be like, that you could definitively be like, oh, I know what's going on there. The next ones I would say are a little bit more telling.
Becomes harder to come up with innocuous explanations for
correct.
Some of these emails.
That's correct. In August of 2012, Brock Pierce says, currently in Moscow, next stop Kiev, and then Odessa. To which Epstein responds, take photos and find me a present. Brock Pierce replies to that with, will do, smiley face. That's gross. But more gross and more telling is that 3 days after that, Brock Pierce sends Jeffrey Epstein 30 plus images of a girl named Anastasia. And he says at the bottom of this email, the Ukraine is now my favorite country, smiley face. I also want to make sure everyone understands it's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine. That is a Russian way of discussing Ukraine, is to call it the Ukraine. So he talks like a Russian. He behaves like a weird creep. And he's taking pictures of women and sending them along to Jeffrey Epstein for reasons undefined, I guess.
Yes. And again, just to preempt any of the lawyers who might be watching this, there are some plausibly not illegal reasons that I guess Brock Pierce would be sharing these pictures, even if those reasons might be immoral. Perhaps they're not illegal. But so, yeah, we see this part of their relationship where they discuss women and things like that.
Well, I want to add one last thing to this part that wasn't actually included in our article. This is something, and we'll in our show notes, we'll link to the CoffeeZilla or Voidzilla, I guess is the channel, Voidzilla video where he discusses some of the stuff he's found. Something that Epstein seems to do regularly is have people go around globetrotting for him, taking pictures and finding women, and then he gets visas issued for them. Brock Pierce and Jeffrey Epstein specifically talk about an E5B visa, or an EB5 visa. And that is for someone they spend $1 million starting a business, they're allowed to get a temporary residence here in America. So why are Brock Pierce and Epstein getting visas for people? Again, unclear, undefined. We don't know. I don't know. Who knows? We just, it seems very strange. It's not nothing illegal. As you said, don't want lawyers breathing down our neck. But I just wanted to add that little tidbit to this set of affairs that transpired.
We'll come back to some of their financial dealings, but I actually want to jump ahead a little bit to Susie, or Little Sue. Cas, can you just talk briefly about the relationship between Pierce, Epstein, and Sue?
It's a very, very strange set of circumstances. So that the first time, due to terrible redaction by the Department of Justice, which they've gone ahead and already taken back thousands of files. We know that so far. They're probably going to have to take back way more. They did a really terrible job of redacting. And so we know the names of some of the people mentioned in the previous emails that we discussed. The first time that women were sent to see Brock Pierce, one of them was this woman named Sue. Sue comes up a lot in Epstein's emails. I don't know if she's an assistant. I don't know if she's an assistant / something else. It sure feels that way. But Brock Pierce continues to see Susie often, regularly. The relationship continues for years and years and years. And as that relationship continues, Epstein starts to get pretty involved in their relationship, which is, again, very odd to me that Epstein cares. Like he asks, "Are you being faithful to Susie? Are you being faithful to Sue?" He tells Joy Ito, for instance, Brock Pierce is Little Sue's boyfriend. He'll email Brock and say "Hey, it's Sue's birthday," and he's like, "Oh my God, thank you for telling me. I gotta message her." No, don't. You figured it out on your own. Very, very, very weird stuff. But as this relationship continues, by 2018, so now Brock Pierce has known Epstein for 7 years. By 2018, Brock Pierce is married to a woman named Crystal Rose. And yet, he sends Jeffrey Epstein an email in January of 2018 saying, "I'm ready to marry Sue, though I'll have 2 wives. Going to attempt to thread that needle over the next few days with Crystal." I don't know if he tried to he attempted to thread that needle actually with Crystal Rose, or this was something he was just saying to Epstein because he wanted Epstein to think, yeah, I'm still interested in Sue or Susie. I have no idea what happened with this, but that's polygamy. And polygamy is illegal in America. Maybe he meant it in some spiritual way. I don't know. And I don't know how Sue felt about it. And I don't know how Crystal Rose felt about it. But I know that he's laying it out in plain English that his plan is to marry for the second time this woman who was introduced to him by Jeffrey Epstein. I don't think anyone knows what happened with that.
I'm actually not even 100% positive that Brock is married to Crystal in a way that the legal system recognizes.
I know it's a smart contract marriage or something. I don't know what that means.
That's not really the point. I think this more just points to the degree of intimacy between Brock Pierce and Jeffrey Epstein, where they are discussing these intimate personal relationships. Brock seems to have some amount of romantic connection to this person who's clearly in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit. And it is weird to see them so casually discuss so much of this kind of thing when we all know, and Brock should have known, that one of the people involved in this conversation is a pedophile.
That's right. That's right. I want to add, you and I are both married, and it seems so cavalier to discuss somebody who you've promised you're going to be with for the rest of your lives as though it's a game or something. It's clearly the idea of marriage doesn't actually matter to Brock Pierce. There's just some weird reason that he feels like he's ready to marry Sue. Like, why do you need to have two wives? Why can't you just be happy dating? Like, if you want to be polyamorous, fine. That's fine. I don't care. But like the way that he's so cavalier, the condescending attitude, the way that he's treating women and talking about women, it's disturbing, it's disgusting, and it's bizarre. Like, I can't imagine, even if I got into a massive fight with my wife, I would not talk about her this way. It's really, really strange.
It suggests at a very basic level, Epstein and his friends may not have been upstanding men.
Yeah, so surprise, surprise.
Returning to the business relationship between these two, we talked briefly about how Pierce asked for Jeffrey Epstein's advice on this Clearstone gaming fund. There was also Brock Pierce. Before its collapse, Brock Pierce let Jeffrey Epstein know he was thinking about purchasing Mt. Gox, then the largest Bitcoin exchange. And this is a thing that Pierce would keep trying to do. He did it with Sunlot Holdings, which he did in collaboration with John Betts. He did it with Gox Rising, which it was never clear where the money for Gox Rising was coming from. But that was another attempt of Brock Pierce to revive Mt. Gox. There's other weird conversations, like Epstein speaking to Bill Gross of Idea Lab, where he talked about a cryptocurrency that Brock Pierce had pitched him. It's a little bit hard to tell from the description, but it might be an early version of Tether. It seems to more be like an algorithmic stablecoin, but perhaps that was the germination of Tether. The story of Tether is kind of weird when you go back to like the pre-real coin days. And a lot of the Mastercoin people who were involved in it said that like it was over a year from like its initial conception, which would put it around the time this email was sent, to the time they were actually ready to launch it as real coin in the summer of 2014. So that email was sent in May of 2013, around when the Realcoin/Tether founders said they started thinking about this project. There's also Brock Pierce asked Jeffrey Epstein to look over a NASDAQ agreement related to what was then Noble Markets, which was then a cryptocurrency exchange. It became, like we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, an international financial entity called Noble Bank, which for a brief period was Tether's primary tether to the banking system.
Yeah.
As a
to be
whole,
clear, Noble Bank was not a bank,
No.
even though it called itself bank, which I think in the States is illegal. You can't do that. But maybe they have different rules and regulations about IFEs in Puerto Rico.
It's also been softened up a bit in the States. That's why you see like things like Chime, like Walmart's banking thing, Chime, advertise itself as like banking done different, even though it's a fintech and it's not a bank. Like there have been some changes in the advertising rules, letting fintechs advertise their services as banking, even though they're not banks. I think that's a bad choice, but they don't let me make regulations.
A lot of coiners are quite happy about that.
Anyways, I think one of the most fascinating business transactions between these two is the Coinbase investment. Could you talk to us a little bit about the Coinbase investment, Cass?
Oh man, the Coinbase investment is so fascinating and gross to me. Basically, we talked about this. Bennett mentioned this at the top, but basically, these two brothers, Bradford and Bart Stevens, have a cryptocurrency partners 2 LP that they begin in collaboration with Brock Pierce. And Brock Pierce decides to bring Jeffrey Epstein into this fund. It's unclear every investment made in this fund. I'm unsure, and unclear if Epstein put other capital into this fund or if there were other investments made. But the one investment we know for sure that Epstein contributed to was that he dumped $3 million into this fund so that they could make a Coinbase investment. I think a lot of people, myself included until relatively recently, figured that if there's going to be a Bermuda-based like corporation or, that there's ways to hide identity so that not every business necessarily knows who's investing money into their business. But it turns out that's not necessarily true, because as Coinbase is closing this round, it suddenly Brock Pierce is like, hey, if we want to do this, we got to do it right now. Jeffrey, do you want to do this? And Jeffrey says, yes, of course. Yeah, I want to put $3 million into Coinbase. And Pierce then states, okay, well, the only issue is if you really want to do this, I have to tell the founders who you are. He invested, he made the investment. We know there's proof that he got a cash out from this, which we can get into, I don't know, later if we want to, or now. But he absolutely made this investment, which suggests, proves for a fact that Fred I don't know how to say his last name, Fred Ursum and Brian Armstrong knew that Jeffrey Epstein was dumping $3 million into Coinbase. Let's be real. Coinbase was not hard up at this point. They didn't need the $3 million from Jeffrey Epstein. They took it. And the reason they took it is because they thought that no one would know that Jeffrey Epstein invested in Coinbase. Thankfully, we have certifiable proof that not only did Jeffrey Epstein invest in Coinbase, they knew that he invested. They knew that a pedophile who had been arrested in 2008 for procuring a minor for prostitution was going to invest in their company, and they were A-okay with that.
Yeah.
To me, it's not just bad as in I don't like that. It's bad risk management. Seriously.
This was one of the most surprising things that you came across when you were making this article, because I, like you, always assumed that most of the people who were receiving Jeffrey Epstein investments had some pastiche of plausible deniability. But here we have Coinbase, one, surprisingly doing due diligence, and two, doing the due diligence and then being like, Jeffrey Epstein, yes, he passes our due diligence bar.
That's right.
Like, the truly stunning thing about it for me was that what name would they have rejected? Who could Brock Pierce have gone back to those founders with, said the name, and they would have been like, oh no, we can't take that money? Because Jeffrey Epstein apparently doesn't reach that standard. And
incredibly disturbing.
I think that kind of points to how willing so many of these people, so many of these entities were to ignore such atrocities as long as they remained like connected to these centers of power and influence. And that for so many of these men, and it's a lot of men in here, it's like they'll overlook anything if it means they have just this much more marginal access to like power or influence. And that seems to have been like a huge portion of Jeffrey Epstein's like game he was playing here, is he did his very best to cultivate as many of those relationships as possible, and then dangled these relationships kind of like in front of these other people for access. Like, one of the other emails you found was one where Brock Pierce was asking Jeffrey Epstein for an introduction to Larry Summers, another well-known Epstein associate who all over these files is like asking Jeffrey Epstein for romantic advice as he debates whether or not he, as like a 70-year-old man or whatever, should pursue one of his grad students who's in his seminar. God, I hate Larry Summers. That's not the point of this episode. But like, so much of Epstein's role was in acting as like this way to facilitate those kind of high power, high influence, high status relationships between these people. And that because these people so desperately wanted to maintain that access, they could overlook any amount of child rape.
I couldn't possibly put it better. And I think that is a perfect segue actually into exactly the next topic, which is that it turns out Brock Pierce introduced, and this is going to have ramifications for the rest of the world and everyone who lives in it. Brock Pierce introduces Jeffrey Epstein to Steve Bannon. And just, I think most people are familiar with Steve Bannon. He's an evil man. He's a chaos agent. I don't know what else to call him other than someone who similar to like Peter Thiel, wants to see the world burn because he thinks it will be profitable for him. And I don't even know if he would deny any of what I just said. I think he would be fine with that description. These ramifications to me are quite powerful because Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein become very good friends very, very quickly. Epstein calls him a pretty smart puppet master.
Well, and at the time of Jeffrey Epstein's death, Steve Bannon was in the process of creating a documentary that it seems, though again we're speculating a little bit here, it seems was kind of meant to slot Jeffrey Epstein into the same kind of right-wing eccentric who may have done some sex crimes space that like Peter Thiel often fills nowadays.
I mean, everyone's seen it. There's a picture of Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein taking a selfie together in front of a mirror. Like, these guys became really good friends. And I think it's fair to say that Steve Bannon probably influenced Jeffrey Epstein, but I think Jeffrey Epstein also influenced Steve Bannon. And a lot of the despicable, disgusting missions he's accomplished, whether it be through the Trump administration or otherwise, I assume some of those ideas came from Jeffrey Epstein. So I mean, I think this is probably the most damaging for the rest of us. This is one of the more damaging relationships that occurs, just based on the level of influence that Steve Bannon has at the time, and who he knows, right? So I look at this and it freaks me out. I don't know how to say it otherwise. It freaks me out that they were besties.
Part of my difficulty in discussing some parts of these files is it is very easy to sound like a conspiracy theorist, to sound like you're describing a right-wing conspiracy that cannot actually exist, right? That Bannon was so involved with like getting the Brexit movement started, and then Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein are emailing each other to celebrate when Brexit passes, and Bannon is doing this documentary for Epstein, and Epstein is convincing Moot to reopen Poll, which leads to like Nick Fuentes and the Gropers and a whole bunch of the like alt-right damage that they ended up doing. And like, it is literally a right-wing conspiracy. And I think in some sense, they've probably been more successful than they imagined they would be when they were taking many of these individual actions. But like, it is disturbing to see them so openly plot the downfall of civilization effectively. Like when Epstein is messaging Peter Thiel about Brexit, Jeffrey Epstein says, "It's just the beginning." And Peter Thiel is like, "The beginning of what?" And so Jeffrey Epstein is like, "The return to tribalism, amazing new alliances. You and I both agreed zero interest rates were too high," which I don't know what he means by that. He wanted negative interest rates? Like,
yeah.
Yeah. Maybe he did, right? Maybe he had fully committed to Bitcoin at that point. I don't understand the economics of what he's suggesting there to say zero interest rates are too high. Like
a lot of people have put forward the idea of negative interest rates, you know. Sure,
and they're used sometimes. Like the European Commission uses them, and the Bank of Japan has used them at times. They are an important part of modern central bank theory. However, generally,
right.
You don't go zero is too high.
Right.
And there's, especially in the United States, a lot of economists tend to think that the long period of extended, very historically low interest rates may have led to some malinvestment. Broadly, like you're saying, it's just so unpleasant to see like a pedophile at a center of a right-wing conspiracy to destroy so many of the institutions that are important to our world, and they seem to be succeeding.
Yeah. There's something, I will say that as I spent days and days and days going through the Epstein files. And I really do think if you have the stomach for it, I urge people to look people up and try to at least like do some, I'm not saying become a citizen journalist. I don't want to push more people to do that because a lot of people are terrible at doing journalism. And it makes it harder for anyone who's good at it. But I do think it's worth looking at some of this stuff with your own eyes because it's real. These are not conspiracy theories. Like, we have the information. It's right there. It's from years ago. This is not being changed and altered outside of being redacted poorly. There is no conspiracy. Jeffrey Epstein was human trafficking. He was using the elites and rich people that he knew to help him do human trafficking. The idea that there's old men with money going around the world finding women and shipping them off to an island, it sounds insane. It sounds insane. It sounds like something someone in a mental institution would say.
It sounds like the Pizzagate nonsense, right? Like the stuff QAnon believed about cosmic pizza and stuff, but like
it's real.
It happened.
Yeah, it's real. That is why I just want people. I can't tell you how many times I would be looking through these files and my jaw would just drop and I would go, no fucking way. No way they're saying this shit in an email. No way you're taking notes on a fucking criminal conspiracy. What are you doing? We've had this discussion so many times. I'm glad they did it because they're all getting caught now. But you'd think these powerful, wealthy men would know better. But they're doing something really stupid. And I don't know what that says. I don't know what that says about the world that we live in. I don't know what that says about what the powerful and elites are actually like. I don't, and obviously this isn't everyone. This is like, you're not going to find every name in here, but you're going to find a lot of them. And a lot of them were real chummy with him, including Brock Pierce. So the final thing I want to say, and if you want to, we can get into some of this other stuff, but the final thing I want to personally say is that the most damning part about this, whether you want to say nothing illegal is shown in the emails, nothing criminal happened necessarily. Jeffrey Epstein was a known convicted pedophile in 2008. Everyone knew. It was big news. By 2010, everyone and their mom knew exactly who Jeffrey Epstein was and what he was accused of and what he was convicted of. And yet, Brock Pierce and a lot of people like him chose to, instead of distancing themselves from him, instead of being like, oh, that's a creep, I don't want anything to do with him, they became his best friend. Brock Pierce knew Jeffrey Epstein basically until the day he got arrested again. They were sending emails back and forth through 2019. 8 years as best friends. That says a lot about Brock Pierce. It says a lot about him and his character and what he cares about. It's not good. None of this is good. I don't care if it's illegal at this point. I just don't care. This is atomic reputational damage. It should be. If it's not, if this guy is not castigated and shunned for what he's done, I don't know what we're doing.
I agree. I think the most damning thing about the files, like we've kind of already said in this episode, is the fact that they expose the broad willingness of so many people to continue to interface with this pedophile, with this sexual predator. And that's clearly Brock Pierce, right? He becomes quite literally friends with him. But I think it's also, like we have said, Coinbase. It's Brian Armstrong and Fred Ersham. It is so many of these individuals who do the due diligence, who ask, who is this guy, who look this guy up and say, oh, okay, it was only one time he got convicted of being a pedophile, and decide, it's $3 million. I'm not going to say no to $3 million. And in the process, by being willing to accept this predator into their ranks, they further enriched this pedophile. They provided him with more connections, more opportunity, and more plausible deniability, because other people who were now being introduced to Epstein saw him as already being friends and being connected with these people. So new people were like, well, I guess I don't have the full story. All these other people surely must have the full story if they think this is okay. And because of that, Epstein became richer, Epstein became more powerful, and Epstein continued to be able to perpetrate sex crimes against children for years. And that is in large part thanks to people like Brock Pierce, thanks to people like Brian Armstrong, thanks to people like Fred Ursham. Even if they never saw Epstein commit a single crime, knowing he was the criminal and being able to see his game in that way, they helped enrich and empower him.
Possibly over $100 million that Epstein earned from that Coinbase investment. Think about that. Brock Pierce and Coinbase helped Jeffrey Epstein possibly make over $100 million. That says everything, right? And lastly, I know that Cascoin is repeatedly mentioned in the Epstein files, but